Chapter 8. From Hunter to Shepherd. I wiped away the sweat that was pooling on my brow. I struggled to tie the last knot of my latest creation in the dim lighting. The fireflies in the jar that Zecora lent me were falling asleep on me. Lucky insects, I wish I had that sort of time. A bone-chilling gust of wind shook the tree I worked in. I coughed until I barely had any breath in me.
"Hunter, you must rest,"
the voice urged.
"It is unhealthy for you to be working this late."
My raspy throat coughed in protest against my sudden talking. I waited for the coughs to wear down before speaking again. I don't care. I made a promise and I'm going to keep it. I finally managed to fasten the vine to the wooden log. Relief flooded me. That was the last trap for this sector. Only 2 more needed some more improving before the field trip. How many days did that leave me with? 2? Maybe 3?
"None."
The voice answered for me.
"This is your 7th night since your encounter with the Pony Princess."
You don't say. My voice trailed off. It didn't feel like that long. Ever since Zecora gave me a map of the field trip's path, I devoted all of my spare time to creating and testing elaborate traps that I had thought of. The only time I paused was for food, water, and the occasional urge to relieve myself of waste.
"Rest, now. The ponies do not deserve your full attention."
You still don't trust them, do you?
"No, we don't, and neither should you."
I rolled my eyes at the voice's paranoia and slowly climbed down the tree. It was late in the night. The field trip would probably start late in the morning. If I wanted to be in my best condition, I would have to sleep soon. Alright, you win, I yawned. I'll head back to the castle and catch a few Z's.
"It is about time."
I released the fireflies and navigated my way through the forest with nothing but the full moon as a light source. I would have kept the glowing insects, but they wouldn't stay awake long enough to be reliable. I had virtually the entire trip planned out in my head. I would stay out of sight, but close enough to the foal so that I could discreetly trigger the traps I made to help them if things got a bit too hairy. I already knew of the dangerous creatures that inhabited some parts of the trail. Truthfully, there was nothing dangerous about them. They were just extremely territorial from what evidence I gathered, and with both Zecora and Lyra volunteering as chaperons, it would be relatively easier to help from the shadows. I thought about my traps again. They were tested plenty of times to prove their worth, but it would all boil down to whether or not they were actually effective in the real deal.
"This is quite the architectural feat for a lone man."
I smiled. Was that a compliment I just heard?
"Yes. And don't get used to it either."
I laughed for a bit until my throat became clogged and had to cough to painfully reopen my esophagus. Ugh, I feel like I could just roll over and die right now, I groaned as I entered the castle. I fell to my hands and knees and began hacking on the floor. Each cough sent painful jolts through to my chest. I ever so slowly rose back to my feet and continued my ascent to the throne room.
"You are not required to do this,"
the voice said.
"You have already done everything in your power to ensure their protection. Why bother taking it a step further?"
A scratchy sigh escaped my system. I had asked myself that same question so many times. I guess it's just in my nature. I plopped down on the cushioned throne and plucked up the vial of medicine from my first encounter with Zecora. There were probably only 2 mouthfuls left. I recently took my 3rd swig to see if it would cure my sickness. It obviously didn't work. With a frown, I set it back down in its proper place. Moonlight glinted off of the blue shards of armor. I realized that in my 2 weeks of inhabiting this fortress, I never really given them a good look. They always possessed an odd air, and I never had the curiosity to inspect them. Well, not until now, that is. Disregarding my complaining joints, I rose up from the comfy seat and waltzed over to the peculiar artifacts. There's nothing odd about them at first glance, unless one thought blue pieces of armor randomly distributed across the floor was odd. They came in various shapes and sizes. I picked up the largest piece and studied it. It was cold, like I was holding a block of ice. The shape suggested that it was some kind of elaborate helmet, one built for a pony at that. 3 holes dotted the top of it. The two larger ones must have been for the eyes or ears, and the smaller one for the horn. Through the odd shape, I could gather a general image of what the pony's head must have looked like. I wonder what kind of pony you were, I whispered as I toyed with it. I gently placed it back down and looked at the actual shards. My curious side took over, and I found myself trying to piece them back together, like a puzzle. As a result, I had four loosely assembled parts for the pony's legs, and a very fragile and extravagant-looking necklace with a crescent moon sketched on the front. There was no doubt in my head that this pony must have been large. I cautiously lifted the shard with the crescent moon, trying my hardest not to disturb the rest of the necklace. So much could have happened to this pony. I longed to know just what. Why was his or her armor shattered? What were her last few minutes like? What was he or she like? Why was she here? Did she have any ties to this place? Who was he or she? There were so many questions. Questions that may never be answered. I longed for a chance to talk to this pony, just to ask them. But for all I knew, the pony could have been long gone. With a depressed sigh, I carefully placed the shard back into its appropriate space and returned to the throne. I closed my eyes and allowed the tranquil sounds of midnight forests to carry me into slumber. I met up with Sakura the next morning on my way to the forest entrance. We exchanged as many details as we could about the upcoming field trip. The rhyming zebra seemed uneasy about all of my precautions, but didn't talk too much on the subject. She was more about my health. "Perhaps you should not watch over us, friend," she suggested as I coughed. "You did not look as if you will survive to the end." I paused to clear my throat again, leaned up on the large net for support. Although, I suppose it couldn't be called a net anymore. The actual net was torn off due to an unfortunate stroll through the forest. All that remained was the long handle and ring. "Don't worry about me," I whipped off. "I'll be just fine. Besides, if all goes according to plan, I shouldn't have to do too much." Sakura didn't seem assured, but allowed me to follow anyways. When the forest entrance came up, I let her get ahead of me to join the massive pony stationed at the front. It was a decent-sized crowd from my perspective. There were roughly 2 regular-sized ponies for every one foal. I assumed they were the parents. It was easy to see the divide between the two parties. The foals were playing around, divided into various cliques of a stereotypical school, each bearing a miniature saddlebag on their backs. The parents or relatives were chatting amongst themselves as they watched their children horsing around. Sakura met up with Lyra and a magenta pony I had never seen before. I figured she was this Miss Cherylee character who would be leading the trip. After a couple of minutes, the foals waved goodbye to their family as they followed Miss Cherylee into the forest. I retreated deeper into the foliage, but before I completely hid myself from sight, a yellow and peaked Pegasus stood out of the crowd of foals. "Oh no," I groaned. "Not her." "All right, class, gather round," Cherylee said with a cheery tone. The foals congregated around her and attentively waited for further instructions. Lyra, Sakura, and Fluttershy appeared to be taking a head count. "Does every pony have their pencils and paper?" The class hurriedly got out the requested items and displayed them to the teacher. "Good! Now remember, fillies and colts, the point of this field trip is to survey some of the Everfree Forest's unique flora and fauna. Your assignment is to choose something you find in the Everfree and write an essay based on your observations. Are there any questions?" A brave orange unicorn with a short teal mane raised his hoof. "Yes, Snails?" What's flora and fauna?" "That is a good question, Snails. Flora and fauna are the plants and animals that inhabit a specific ecosystem. In lay ponies' terms, they are the living things that live in an area. You can choose anything from the unique flowers and squirrels to the more dangerous subjects such as bears and poison joke. Any other questions?" Oh, me, pick me!" Scootaloo shouted as she finally tried to get the teacher's attention. "Yes, Scootaloo?" "Does that mean we can do it on the beast?" the filly asked with a bright smile. Cherylee seemed conflicted. "Well, I suppose if we see it, then that would be all right." Scootaloo jumped in the air. "Yes! I call dibs!" A few audible groans sounded from the group. "However," Cherylee interrupted, "I don't think we will be seeing it. Twilight gave me explicit instructions on what we were supposed to do if we run into the monster. We are to stay away from it. The foals let out many disappointed awes at the revelation. But I guess if the monster is far enough away, then you can try to write a report on it. Any more questions before we leave? A pink filly with an elaborate tiara in her mane casually raised her hoof. She didn't even wait for acknowledgement before saying, "What if we were attacked? No pony here can deny that every forest is dangerous." "Don't worry, Diamond Tiara. Fluttershy has kindly offered to lend a hoof in case things get hectic." The answer seemed to please many of the young students. After Shirley made sure that there were no more questions, they set off, with me close behind. As soon as Lyra was close enough for me to reach through the bushes, I grabbed her tail and pulled her in.
What the heck is Fluttershy doing here?
I hissed. It took the unicorn a moment to come to her senses.
Hunter? You look awful.
Gee, thanks. Back to my question, please.
Well, Fluttershy is really good with animals, so Miss Shirley asked her if she could come with us.
Lyra must have caught on to my discomfort.
Is something wrong? How do you know her?
I grimaced as the shameful memories came back. I'd rather not talk about it. Besides, I think you're needed. Lyra didn't seem convinced, but she eventually nodded and hopped out of the bush and into the crowd. An hour passed by. So far, nothing worth mentioning had transpired. Zagora helped identify some of the plants, Fluttershy showed some of the foals the various types of wildlife, and Shirley and Lyra made sure no one was left behind. Some of the foals had already chosen a topic for research. Others were waiting for something a bit more interesting to write about. A deep growl emitted from a large shaking bush up ahead. A large feline with bat-like wings, a scorpion's tail, and a lion's mane pounced out. It was a manticore, one of the more territorial ones, too. It snarled at the ponies. I rushed up a nearby tree to my nearest trap, and made sure that the beast was in my trap's line of sight before triggering it. If the beast made one false move, I would sever the vine that was holding the log suspended in the air, causing it to swing down and bat the abomination out of sight. My body tensed up with anticipation. I gingerly laid my fingers over the knot on the vine, preparing to make the swift pull that would fire the log in seconds. Just then, Fluttershy calmly floated over to the manticore, as if unaware of the potential danger.
What is she doing?
I hissed.
She's going to get herself killed. Wait,
the voice said.
We wish to see how this plays out.
I reluctantly removed my hand from the vine. For Fluttershy's sake, I hoped she knew what she was doing.
Hush now, it's okay, she cooed. We're on a school trip. Would you mind if some of us took a look at you? I'm sure there are some fools here wanting to write a paper about such a large, majestic creature like you.
The manticore looked hesitant, then nodded in agreement. My mouth hung again, agape. Did I just see what I think I saw?
Thank you very much.
Fluttershy turned around to the rest of the school group, who were as shocked as I was.
Did any pony want to write about the manticore?
A pair of hoofs shot up, one belonging to the tall orange colt from before, and the other to a short teal colt. They looked like exact opposites of each other. They hesitantly approached the towering manticore, which seemed equally wary. With Fluttershy's assistance, the two colts studied the chimera, taking notes, drawing pictures, and stroking its fur occasionally.
Well, that was a bit anticlimactic,
the voice mused. I released the breath I was subconsciously holding in. I'm just glad they're okay. I am a bit disappointed that I didn't get to use my trap, though. After taking another glance at the manticore to reassure myself, I climbed down the tree and decided to scout the area up ahead. It was probably going to take some time for the two unicorns to collect their data, so I figured it would give me some time to think. What Fluttershy did was absolutely amazing. I had never seen that manticore so friendly before. Whenever I came along, it always growled and threatened to give me a new haircut. Maybe ponies were just more in tune with nature than I was? Who could tell?
Cool!
I snapped back to attentiveness and found myself in the middle of the dirt road. My body was paralyzed in fear that I had been spotted. I slowly turned my head and discovered that my fears were correct. Standing a small distance away from me was Scootaloo. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and she quickly pulled out a pencil notebook.
Just stand still for a moment, she mumbled.
I wasn't about to listen to her. Instead, I darted in the other direction.
Wait, I wasn't done yet!
I could hear her scream. The faint pitter-patter of her tiny hooves was barely audible compared to my rapid stomping. I made a sudden sharp turn to the trees and continued running. Scootaloo wasn't in sight when I made the turn, so I figured I had lost her. With the filly no longer chasing me, I slowed down and began coughing up the mucus and other obstructions that my throat had accumulated during the run. My breathing slowed back down to a regular pace. My heart, however, was still beating like mad. After a reasonable amount of waiting, I wandered back to where I had left the school group. That was too close for comfort, I grumbled.
We agree. It was unwise of you to wander like that.
Well, I didn't mean to. It's just that...
Scootaloo! Don't move!
A shriek sounded. Scootaloo's shaky voice was quick to reply.
Why the hey would I?
I dashed to the source of the commotion, careful to stay in the trees. Scootaloo's orange coat soon appeared between the green leaves. I crept closer to see what the problem was. Scootaloo was sitting down and shaking horribly, with her eyes sealed tight. A few steps closer revealed the group of foals further away, shielding their eyes. However, some could not resist sneaking a peek from the filly's direction. I couldn't tell what they were so afraid to look at. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard a chicken's clucking. Between the two parties, something I never expected to see was there. It had the head and general build of a chicken. However, only the head resembled the bird. The remainder of the body was covered in green scales, giving a strange dragon-like appearance.
"Somebody, get Fluttershy!" Miss Charlie demanded. "Tell her we have a cockatrice!"
Cockatrice. I remembered reading something about those things in Greek mythology, and if what I remembered was correct, then Scootaloo was in deep trouble. The monstrosity was circling around the poor filly, trying to get her to open her eyes. I had to do something, but I didn't set up any traps here. Sweat started dripping off me. What was I going to do? There was no way Fluttershy was going to make it before Scootaloo opened her eyes.
"Don't do it, Hunter,"
the voice warned. At that moment, I didn't care. This could be my chance to make things right. Forget you and your words of wisdom. That pony needs help now! I burst out of the bushes. Scootaloo and the cockatrice were directly in front of me. The audience of ponies was to my left, with most of their eyes shielded. The chicken-lizard hybrid was too focused on Scootaloo to pay any lick of attention to me. That was its first mistake. I swung my staff at the cockatrice, tilting it at an angle so that the ring would sweep its feet out from under it. The cockatrice squawked as it suddenly lost its balance and fell to the ground. Without hesitation, I covered the small distance between us and kicked it like a ball into the trees. With the hazard out of the way, I dropped my staff, hoisted Scootaloo in my arms, and hurried her over to her classmates. The small piglet opened her eyes to see what the cause of her sudden elevation was, and was quite surprised to see me.
"Monster!"
she squealed, and she kicked around in my arms, bruising my chest and making it near impossible to carry her. I was more than glad to dump her on the spot when I reached the crowd, who was staring at me in pure horror as I thundered closer to them. I guess seeing a towering monster holding a kicking and screaming filly wasn't the most reassuring sight. Scootaloo gave me one last kick in the stomach as I dropped her and scurried off into the crowd. "You're welcome," I growled as I covered my wounded body. The ponies cautiously backed up.
"We told you they would never accept you. You are a monster to them, nothing more, nothing less. You are foolish to think otherwise."
Anger boiled inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. With a scowl, I turned away from the terrorized foals and marched off. I couldn't tell who I was angry at. The ponies were still being afraid of me even after I saved them, or I for believing it would be so simple. Things like that only happen in fantasy stories, so I guessed it would make more sense to be mad at myself. Something jumped out of the bushes. On instinct, I reached out and grabbed the foreign object. That was my mistake. The cockatrice had returned, and this time it was angry. Unfortunately, for both of us, I had my hand wrapped around its neck. It squawked and flapped its green wings loudly. Its sharp talons dug through my jacket and into my skin. I wanted to let go, but the pain in my arm forced my fist to stay clenched. I tried shaking it to wear it down, but that only succeeded in making it angrier. That was when I saw its eyes. How can I describe what I saw in those eyes? To say it was utterly horrifying would be considered an insult compared to the sheer magnitude of raw atrociousness that was buried deep in those blood-red eyes. It was as if someone had managed to gather every nightmare ever perceived by mankind and stuffed it through my optics and burned it in my brain. Even that didn't begin to scratch the surface of what I endured. I recoiled and clamped my eyes shut. The horrid afterimage was still in my eyes. I desperately massaged my eyelids to remove it, but to no avail. With nothing else working, I opened my eyes and stared at the ground for a fresher image. The ground looked different. Not in the sense that it had changed into a different type of earth, but in the sense of color. It had a peculiar shade of gray to it. Just like everything else. Thump! I slowly turned around, not that I had much of a choice as to how quickly I rotated. It felt as if I was moving underwater. In my new, gray-tinted vision, I could see a humanoid statue laying on the ground with a squirming cockroach in its outstretched arm. The statue looked uncomfortably familiar. I took a few uneasy steps to examine the statue further. A sense of dread washed over me.
It turned the monster to stone!
That pretty much summed it up. I was staring down at my petrified self, not knowing how to respond. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to do many things, but for some reason I just stood there, mystified at my stone-cold body. I cast a worried glance at the spectating ponies. Could they see me? The me that wasn't frozen in Stone Age? Lara's head popped in behind the crowd. "Sunpony, get Fluttershy, now!" she shouted. Zecora galloped away to where I could only assume Fluttershy was. A shadow flashed from the corner of my vision. I rolled around to see a humanoid silhouette standing idly in the forest. The silhouette turned and retreated deeper into the trees. "Hey!" I shouted. "Wait up!" I chased the mysterious shadow through the forest. Whatever this thing was sure knew its way around. It didn't pause or hesitate whenever it changed direction. It moved with such ease, I almost thought it was going through the obstacles in its way. But that would have been ridiculous. Right? The chase soon came to an end as I cornered the silhouette at the base of a cliff. "Where are you going to go now?" I challenged. The silhouette faced me and lifted its arms, gesturing me to advance. "It's time to see what you really are," I grumbled. However, before I could actually approach it, the figure jumped through the rocky wall. Through it, not over it, not around it, through it. What the... My voice lazily drifted off. Boo. If I had any skin, I probably would have jumped out of it. The devious silhouette somehow teleported behind me. I turned around and reached out, but the figure was already running. "Get back here!" I demanded as I pursued it. The chase seemed to last for an eternity. All the while I was chasing my prey, mocking and laughing rang throughout the forest. My temper quickly rose. In a painfully slow fashion, I caught up with the figure. It was just barely out of my reach now. I just had to reach a tad bit further. Further! My body suddenly became limp, and I consequently fell. I could only glare at the figures that leisurely sprinted further and further away. A strange breeze flew through the forest. A dull aching pulsed through my head. It wasn't one of the usual headaches, though. This one made me drowsy rather than give me pain. "Oh, poor Hunter," a voice filled with mock sympathy rang throughout the forest. Why did it sound so familiar? "You were so close to catching me, too. No matter. We'll see each other in due time." The gray tint grew more intense. Sounds started to melt together. I gave in to the numb feeling. I fell into a quasi-sleep. A worried voice pierced through the white noise. "Hunter! Hunter! Can you hear me? Say something!" I struggled to open my eyes, but they were too heavy to budge. I instead made a weak grunt. "He's alive! Oh, thanks, Celestia. I was so worried." I could barely feel myself being pulled up. Some foreign object wrapped itself around me into a crushing hug. I wished I could open my eyes, or talk for that matter. A soft voice popped up.
Lyra, I think you're crushing the poor thing.
I moaned in agreement. Oh, right, sorry, Hunter. Lyra's voice chuckled. I could feel myself being lowered back down to the ground. My eyes fluttered open. My vision was instantly assaulted by the vibrant colors of the forest, forcing me to close my eyes again. I took in deep breaths of the cold air to try and wake myself up better, but in the middle of an inhale my throat clogged and I started coughing.
It's okay,
The soft voice cooed.
just lie down and rest for a bit. We won't hurt you.
I opened my eyes again. Everything was still out of focus, but I could make out the blurs of color above me, one a mint green and the other yellow with a pink top. As the details began to sharpen, I could make out Lyra and Fluttershy's figures staring at me from above. What happened? I croaked.
You should have seen it, Hunter!
Lyra bounced excitedly.
When the cockatrice turned you into stone, the squirrel went to get Fluttershy. The cockatrice was trying to get out of your hand, but you had it in your grip when you turned it to stone. And then Fluttershy came and practically exploded on the thing. I don't think I've ever seen her do anything quite like that before. She somehow convinced the cockatrice to turn you back to flesh, and when it did, you were all knocked out. So we stood here trying to wake you up for the past, 30 minutes. Fluttershy blushed and shrank back throughout Lyra's rant. It wasn't anything, really, she whispered. I just didn't want you to stay as a stone statue is all.
I was having a hard time digesting this information. If what Lyra said was true, then it seemed as if I owed Fluttershy. Great. Just great. As if already feeling guilty for our previous encounters wasn't enough, but now the same Pegasus went out of her way to help me. With a grunt, I slowly sat up and crossed my legs. I didn't say anything simply because I didn't know what to say. Too many thoughts were bouncing around in my head for me to think straight. The voice was eager to throw in its 2 cents.
You should leave. Every second you stay here is another second for these ponies to attack you or turn you in. Some of them might have already left to fetch Twilight. It is too dangerous here.
You're probably right, I mumbled.
Of course we are. Now leave and let the ponies fend for themselves. You have already done your part to protect them.
Sounded good to me. The ponies had already proven that they could handle themselves, so why bother helping them? Besides, maybe the princess would give me points for trying. I stood up and started walking away. Lyra quickly jumped on my path. Hold on! Just where do you think you're going? She demanded. Look, the only reason I tagged along on this field trip was to offer some assistance. And from what I've gathered, you ponies know what you're doing more than me, so I don't have any reason to stay. I wandered over to my staff and picked it up. Any more questions? I asked.
Do you have to go? Couldn't you stay a bit longer?
I turned around to the yellow Pegasus in confusion.
That is, if you'd like to,
she added, shrinking away from my curious stare.
You don't have to if you don't want to.
Well, This was just unfair. Her pleading eyes were boring straight into mine. Lyra must have caught my discomfort, concerning how her face lit up. Oh, come on, Hunter, she smiled as she pushed the Pegasus closer to me. You know I can't say no to a face like this. First, I must have caught on to the game. She somehow managed to make her eyes wider with pleading intentions. I can't, really, I said, trying to avoid eye contact with the adorable Pegasus. Lyra pushed Fluttershy closer. Why not? Lyra persisted.
Don't you dare listen to them. They can still be deceiving you.
I dumbly said. Please, Hunter, this could be our chance to make things right.
Or it could be the chance to stab you in the back when you least expect it.
Just give us a second chance.
Just like they gave you a second chance.
Once the citizens of Ponyville get to know you, I promise they will accept you.
Yes, because clearly the fools already accept you, even after you saved one of them.
I glanced over at the school of fools, who stared back at me in horror. The conflicting voices were getting to me. I backed away from Lyra and Fluttershy to collect my thoughts. Why did these decisions have to be so hard? Why couldn't someone just make the decision for me so that I wouldn't have to go through this? Someone tugged at my jacket. I glanced down to see Fluttershy pulling at it with her mouth.
You don't have to come if you don't want to. It was was only a suggestion, she whispered.
That didn't help me at all. If anything, it deepened the tear in my mind. But I don't know if I want to go, I groaned. I just don't.
You don't want to, and you know that. Run while you still have that chance.
But did I? Or was that the voice inside of me trying to convince me? Did it really matter, though, as long as it came from me? But if it came from me, then why did it always argue? Hey, Hunter, Lara piped up, interrupting my train of thought. Look, if you don't feel comfortable doing this, then you can just go. Zecora and I can take it from here. She sounded so disappointed. The look on her face wasn't reassuring either. Nevertheless, I turned and walked away. I regretted every step I took. My mind constantly asked what would happen if I returned to them. And Lyra, I let her down horribly. I hated myself for it, too. She was really hoping that I would come around for her, that everything would be better. But I had to screw everything up as usual, and chicken out the second I was given the very opportunity I longed for. The sound of her voice, it was practically dripping with malcontent. I wish I could have done something to fix that. I hated letting people down. But her terms were just too high for me. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. No, I trusted her almost with my life. But the others? I didn't trust them about as far as I could through them. With the exception of Zecora and Fluttershy, of course. I was scared for my well-being. That was only natural, right? One could even argue that it was a healthy fear. But for this long, it's been what, 2 weeks going on 3? I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep living in constant fear. But it was so easy. Why does it have to be so hard? I screamed. I funneled all of my anger and confusion through my fist into a nearby tree. Oh, sweet mother of... I strained to fight back the words that were trying to force their way out of my lips. I stared at my bleeding knuckles. The pain. For a moment, it put me in a moment of bliss. For that one sweet, blessed moment, all of my anger and discontent was erased. But it wasn't to last. I fell to my knees and cradled my bloody hand. Nothing could have prevented my silence of those memories, both good and bad, demanded attention. I hated myself for that first night in this messed up world. I hated myself for how I acted. I hated myself for what I did to Fluttershy. I hated myself for letting Lyra and Zecora down. They had gone through so much trouble to prove my innocence while I hid away in the false sense of security I had established in my fortress. None of the ponies were listening to them, save for a few. Celestia was somewhat convinced, but only somewhat. If I had faced my fears that one day and gone with them into the town to prove that I was not a monster, then everything would have been fine, right? The ponies just needed a chance to know me, right? Everything would have ended happily ever after, like in those fairy tales I always read as a little kid, right? A shriek pierced the air. I wildly turned around to where I had left school. The cry had definitely come from that direction. There was no doubt in my head. The ponies were in danger.
Oh, please!
The voice spat in disgust.
Don't even pretend that you don't know what will happen if you try to help them again. Their hatred towards you was evident the first time. It would be foolish to think that this time it will be different.
You're right, I sighed. Besides, they have Fluttershy and Zecora to protect them now. They don't need me. Hunter! Help! There was no thought process, no second thoughts about my welfare, no elaborate plan concocted, not even any thoughts as to who cried out. The second that cry, that name reached my ears, I broke into a sprint in its direction. The voice screamed in my head.
What are you doing? Do you really think they will accept you for helping them? They didn't even thank you for the last deed.
I don't care, I panted between deep breaths as I thundered on.
Why, though? Why?
You just don't get it, do you? I shook my head. I don't care whether or not they will appreciate me for what I do. They are in trouble, and only I can help them.
But that doesn't mean you are obligated to.
I could practically feel the voice getting angrier. Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway.
But why?
Because, I breathed as the last turn came into view, it's just in my nature. I rounded the corner and faced what the source of all the commotion was. It was an absolute bedlam. Multicolored foals were running around like chickens with their heads lopped off. Miss Charlie and Lara weren't faring any better. Zecora was desperately trying to fend off wooden monstrosities with a wooden branch. Fluttershy was out of sight entirely. A brown blur of motion leapt at me. In fluid-like movement, I maneuvered the ring of my staff underneath its stomach, assuming there were any organs underneath the chaotic layer of twigs and vines, and used the beast momentum to ferry it over me harmlessly and into the forest screen. I glared at the remaining 4 canine abominations, also known as the Timberwolves. By now I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my arteries, along with the corresponding symptoms. My brain flitted out anything that didn't closely resemble the enemy. For the pony's sake, I prayed that a foal with a brown coat didn't stumble into the fight. I lunged in Zecora's direction to aid in her struggle against one of the wretched wolves. With the creature's back against me, it was more than simple to fit the loop of the staff around its torso. The beast thrashed around inside the metallic restraints in vain. With her adversary now powerless, Zecora swung what was left of her branch and clocked the beast on the side of the head. A sickening snap of breaking wood sounded on impact. Zecora's branch had snapped in half. It wasn't a complete loss, though, as the Timberwolf was knocked out cold. I slithered the unconscious mass of plant life out of my staff. "So, what'd I miss?" I casually asked the heavily breathing zebra. "Hunter, friend, it is a pleasure to see you," she panted. "If not for your help, I would have been overcome soon." "Any way I can help," I nodded. I turned around and surveyed the rest of the chaos. Most of the foals were hiding from the beast, while the more unfortunate ones were still scurrying around, wildly trying to find their own safe haven. The plan slowly found light in the tempest in my head. I didn't know if it would work, but either way the ponies would remain safe. "Zecora, I have a plan. You up to it?" The zebra nodded with determination. "Good. I need you to round up the foals and rush them out of here as fast as you can. No, faster than what you can. I'm going to try and buy you some time. Got it?" Zecora looked troubled, as if she was trying to piece together the plan in her head. A few seconds ticked by before she nodded. "Yes, I understand what to do. But, Hunter, what about you? You are still outnumbered 3 to 1. I cannot see how you will overcome." "I'll worry about the details," I urged. "Just do your part and I'll do mine." Without wasting another second, I rushed back into the chaos. It was fairly easy to get the Timberwolves' attention, both fortunately and unfortunately. On the plus side, Zecora seemed to be doing a fair job of hurting the school of foals. I, on the other hand, was doing poorly. Fending off the wolves was getting progressively more and more challenging. At first, the 3 wolves attacked me one at a time, which could easily be stopped by a simple bat with my staff. Then they started attacking as one. I found myself making moves that I never conceived as possible. My staff was flying around my body, expertly striking down another wolf. It wasn't very effective, however, considering how they were already stubbornly getting right back up. I screamed as a sharp pain flared around my right leg. 2 of the 3 wolves before me pounced. Their honed claws dug into my shoulders. I could barely feel their splintery digits digging around the inside of my skin. I toppled backwards and tripped over a 4th wolf that had its teeth buried into my leg. The sneaky little bugger must have snuck up behind me while I was busy with its companions. The 2 that tackled me clamped their maws on my already bleeding shoulders and dragged me across the ground and up to a tree. I was pinned into a lounging position, too afraid to move due to the ferocious beasts surrounding me. Another wolf snarled at me, daring me to move, while the 4th casually approached me. As the abomination advanced, its frames started shifting. The branches slowly rearranged themselves. The wolf's canine figure was replaced by a bipedal and humanoid one. Its tail seemed to withdraw into its wooden body. Its hind legs still bore a canine resemblance, despite being elongated as human hands sprouted at the edge of its forelegs. The most bizarre change was its countenance. I watched in utter horror as the canine head contorted into that of an old man. The face was still comprised of twigs, however, and his eyes still radiated that sickening shade of yellow. A feral growl came from his throat. "You." One word. one raspy word came from his wooden lips. Just one word struck fear into my very being. If the two wolves didn't have their jaws pinning me down, I would have been shaking like a leaf. You should have never come to this place. His voice. Oh, sweet mercy, his voice. It sounded scratchy, as if someone were grinding two rocks together. It seemed to shake my very senses. The furious gaze in his glowing eyes drew tears of fear out of my eyes. And now, it is time for you to pay for your trespassing. He raised the clawed hand and prepared to deliver the lethal blow that would end my existence in seconds. Wait! I cried. The humanoid hesitated. And why, might I ask, should I? I chuckled weakly. Good question. The humanoid didn't seem pleased with my comment. Why do you want to kill me? I tried. The wooden figure grimaced, which was quite the feat considering his face's makeup. Why, you ask? Because you are a deadly cancer to this harmonic world, that is why. He swung his claw down. I ripped myself out of the wolves' mouths as the result of a primal instinct. I screamed in agony as my skin was ripped and tried to hobble away on my left foot. My staff was only a few feet away. All I had to do was reach it. Then I could... A heavy object rammed into my back, causing me to fall face first into the earth. I didn't let that stop me, though. Against my arm's screams of rebellion, I dragged myself across the dirt to my one weapon of defense. How amusing, the humanoid mused. You clearly must know you are doomed, and yet you still struggle to live on rather than face your fate with honor. Why? Oh, you know. Basic instinct to survive, I wheezed. It tends to be a good motivator. So it seems. The humanoid kicked me over to my back and pressed his deformed foot down on my chest. His scrutinizing gaze studied me. I'll never understand what Star Swirl saw in your kind, he grumbled. He cast a few glances to the left and right, as if checking to see if anybody was eavesdropping. Allow me to make a proposal. It seems as if you have yet to spread your influence over Equestria. Since I am feeling so generous, I will allow you to return home. Come to the portal before nightfall, and you will be sent on your merry way to your home and to your family. Have haste, though. Otherwise, if you are late, I shall unleash my pack on you and hunt you down like the pathetic, insignificant animal you are. He reached down and lifted me up by my feet by my shirt. I felt small compared to his true height. He must have been at least 8 feet tall. For your sake, you had best choose wisely, he growled. He pushed me back to the ground. I was too stunned to react at the moment. Instead, I lay there and watched as he morphed back into his original canine body. After giving me another menacing growl, he and his wolves retreated back into the forest. I stared at the sky, trying to find the willpower to get back to my feet. The sun had already covered 3/4 of its trail across the sky. I didn't have long before the deadline. I had to move now.
He is lying, you know,
the voice said bitterly.
The moment you reach the portal, you will be slaughtered.
Oh, what are you talking about? I asked with a weak smile. He seems like a nice guy to me.
Now is not the time for your jokes, Hunter. This is a matter of your very survival. We cannot allow you to gamble your life for the hope that you might have a chance to go home. Wouldn't your family like to see you alive again?
Talk about hitting it close to home, I muttered. The staff was finally in my hands. I winced as my torn body stood up. My right leg was fragile from the bite. I couldn't put much weight on it without gaining an eruption of pain. I could already feel my shirt sticking and coagulating blood from my shoulders. Using the staff as an awkward crutch, I hobbled towards my castle. I had to agree with the voice. That humanoid was not to be trusted. He didn't like me whatsoever. Therefore he had no reason to spare me. He could easily be toying with me, trying to get my hopes up just to crush them. In my weakened state, there would be no real way to defend myself. I needed to heal myself for the encounter. I needed Zecora's potion. Everything was planned out in my mind. I would go to the castle, take a drink of the potion, take whatever was left of me to wherever this portal was, and hope for the best. This was going to be the most important moment of my life so far. I could not afford to mess it up. A twig snapped behind me.
Careful, you blank flanks!
A hushed voice hissed.
The monster could have heard that!
I continued forward, not even looking behind me to acknowledge the voice. My face twitched in irritation. You have got to be kidding me.